All right, well, welcome back to another episode of Traveling Through History. We're really glad you came today. Today we get to talk about a very special founding father and someone who I think gets overlooked a lot in our history, and that is the father of our Constitution and our Bill of Rights, and our fourth president and our third vice president, and that is James Madison. Another Virginian president. We had 5 of the first 6 were Virginians. Really an amazing man, and I'm really looking forward to going through his life and his accomplishments with you. We're going to talk a little bit about his bio. Then we will get into a video about his life. And we'll also go through my favorite part of the program, as I always do with all of our founding fathers. That's 25 little known facts about James Madison that you might not know otherwise and might cause you to want to dig into his life a little bit more. So excited to take this through with you today. Go ahead and like this video when you get a chance and subscribe to the channel, Traveling Through History. We are going to be giving you a lot more great content coming your way as we finish up the Founding Fathers series. We're also going to be looking at some of the great events in American history. And then we're going to turn our attention also to some of the international figures and events that happened in world history. So we have a lot of great stuff coming your way. So go ahead and like and subscribe. So anyway, about James Madison, born March 16th, 1751 in Port Conway, Virginia. His father was James Madison Sr. He was a tobacco farmer. He worked the land and had a very large estate and plantation in Southern Virginia. His mother was Eleanor Madison. She looked after the children in the home and was a housekeeper and an excellent mother. He was actually the oldest of 12 children, which is pretty amazing to think about, although it was relatively common back then for farming families and plantation families to have a lot of kids. Actually, one of his brothers was the father of President Zachary Taylor, who came several generations later. So kind of an interesting thing that his nephew was president one day. At 17 years old, a young and inquisitive James Madison left Virginia for the University of New Jersey, which now is called Princeton University, but back then it was called the University of New Jersey. He ended up leaving Virginia and going to New Jersey for a really curious reason. All of his friends and people that were his age from Virginia, including Thomas Jefferson, who was a little bit older, but they all went to William and Mary, which was the most prestigious college at the time in Virginia. He went to New Jersey because he was kind of a sickly boy. He had a lot of ailments, and several of the doctors that looked after him said that he might do better as a student up in the north and might have fewer ailments like he was getting in Virginia. I don't know if that's true or not, but that's what the doctors were telling him at the time. When he went to the College of New Jersey, now Princeton, he quickly became one of the favorite students of the professors there. He was a voracious reader and studier, with studies sometimes up to 16 or 17 hours a day. Really got a name for himself in college and was one of the best students, and the only student there, by the way, from a southern state at the time. So he must have been quite a curiosity to the northern students and people that were there at the time. He became a master in Latin and Greek and philosophy. He learned several other languages like French. Because of his young health problems that he had, he always throughout his life, including in college, was a little bit of a hypochondriac. And so even though he was constantly studying all day long and spending long hours in the library, he was always complaining of some type of ailment, and got a little bit of a reputation for that as well. So after he returned to his father's plantation home, which was called Montpelier, I actually highly recommend you go to Montpelier if you're ever visiting Virginia. Go see Jefferson's Monticello and go see James Madison's Montpelier, which he inherited from his father. He returned as a college graduate, and he spent a year tutoring his younger children. There were younger brothers and sisters, younger siblings, and he really enjoyed that kind of teaching aspect of that role he played for that year. And he started talking to several of the gentlemen in the surrounding area that were around his age, including at this time he met Thomas Jefferson. He decided to read the law. And back then, you didn't actually formally go to law school. You just read the law under the tutelage of an attorney. So he started to read the law. He found the law actually quite boring, and he did not want to become a lawyer after he read the law. So that was kind of an interesting aspect of his situation there. He found politics much more interesting and started actually writing political papers and opinion pieces for a local newspaper. He started debating people of the day in local pubs and at meeting places. He actually ran for the local county commission and actually won in his early 20s. That was his first political post he got, was the county commission. Then at his county commission post, he heard about the Virginia militia and felt like because he was an ambitious type and wanted to have a political future that he might need to get some military service under his belt. So he joined the Virginia militia for a while, rose up the ranks fairly quickly, became an officer. However, even when he was there, he decided, just like with the law, that a military career for his whole career was not what he wanted to do. He still wanted to go into politics. Eventually got elected to the Virginia 5th Convention, and they found out very quickly that not only was he a philosopher and one of their best thinkers, even though he was relatively young, he was also the best writer in that 5th convention in Virginia, which was saying something because you can imagine all the talent he was surrounded by with Jefferson and James Monroe and all of the folks that from Virginia ended up becoming big time political forces. But he was the best writer. So they had him um, write the Virginia Constitution, or at least the first draft of it. And this became very much a noble pursuit for him, something he was very interested in for the rest of his life, and became the foundation, now that he had written a state constitution, very much for what he was going to do later in life to become the father of our U.S. Constitution and our Bill of Rights. We'll talk a lot about that in this program, and really his most proud accomplishment was writing those two documents, in addition to, of course, his contributing role by writing or being one of the three authors of the Federalist Papers, which was a very important aspect of getting the Constitution passed. So at this time, as I said, he had met Thomas Jefferson. They started becoming fast friends and meeting a lot and talking about politics, talking about government, talking about England's overreach. The colonies were starting to get disturbed and upset with the way England was pushing them around and taxing them and coming up with new restrictive laws and taking away freedom. And Jefferson and Madison would stay up sometimes late at nights over candlelight talking about what could be done about it and how could we create a more just society. This was really the beginnings of the colonies and the leaders in the colonies starting to talk about what could be done. He then eventually got elected to the Second Continental Congress from Virginia, largely on the basis of his role in creating the Virginia Constitution. He actually played a humongous role in drafting the U.S. Constitution. He was not the sole author of it, but was certainly the driving force behind it and wrote large portions of it and argued for the actual founding principles of it. And we'll get into a lot more detail about what that was, but in effect brought the Virginia Plan, they call it, quote unquote, the Virginia Plan, to the Continental Congress, and it got incorporated into the U.S. Constitution. The basis of the Virginia Plan was a split role for government so that there was lots of checks and balances against each other. So you had an executive that counterbalanced against the legislative body, and even the legislative body was going to be split up, some with population representation, some with states representation. And then, of course, you had the judicial, which is the courts, and that would also counterbalance out the other branches. So this was very much the plan that he was putting forward, called the Virginia Plan, and it was all about checks and balances and balancing out power between the federal system and the states and making sure that there was never any possible chance for tyranny. Interestingly enough, Madison was against the Bill of Rights at first, even though later he was credited for being the founder of the Constitution and the main proponent of the Bill of Rights. But at first, he didn't think it was necessary. He very much believed that those rights were innate and given by God. And he also believed that the state constitutions could handle individual rights. He felt that the U.S. Constitution at the federal level needed to be very limited and talk about the limited powers of the federal government and did not need to worry about individual liberties. However, after much debate with the other Congress goers and people from all the different states, especially the southern states, who felt very strongly that even though it was in their state constitutions, they wanted it codified in the U.S. Constitution to protect those 10 sets of individual rights. And he eventually turned to that and decided it was a good idea, and then became, of course, the biggest proponent and arguer for it in all of their deliberations, and pushed it all the way through to completion and then enactment. He eventually got elected to Congress as a U.S. congressman. He spent 8 years as Secretary of State. He was vice president, and then, of course, took over as president after Thomas Jefferson left office in 1808. He took over in 1809. Probably the most famous policy he had that ended up becoming a war with England was the War of 1812. They called it Madison's War. This was something that had been creeping up in the United States for a while. It was definitely not all his fault, although a lot of his policies when he got into office goaded England into actually wanting this war. England, though, had been poaching on the United States in lots of ways, out west at the Great Lakes, down south in places like New Orleans, in some of the western territories just outside the Mississippi. Even in New England, they had been poaching. They had been picking away at the colonies to see what they could get away with, and even sinking naval ships or capturing naval ships and taking all the stock of the ships and taking soldiers captive. Many, many things contributed to the War of 1812. So eventually we had to have it out again, even though it was only 40 years later since we'd had it out with them one time. Obviously, that war was very contentious. It only went on for 2.5 years, ironically, but most of the battles were fought either in New England or along the eastern seaboard, Baltimore, Washington, D.C., etc., or at sea. There was a lot of naval battles in the War of 1812, and there, in some cases, the new Americans got the best of England. Like they had some good battles on the Great Lakes themselves, and then in a couple of cases, they actually lost the battle. In the end, the War of 1812 ended up in a stalemate. It was essentially a draw. Both sides were exhausted after 2.5 years of war. Their treasuries were drained, and decided to call a truce, and they signed a peace treaty. After James Madison had done all these great things for the country, U.S. Constitution, Bill of Rights, the Federalist Papers, served in every post you could in the federal government, he ended up returning home to Montpelier after his presidency, and he was flat broke. Very similar to Jefferson, who had come back after the presidency and been in a very debt situation. Same with Madison. He had an adopted son from his wife, Dolly, who had racked up huge gambling debts, which he had to assume. He came back to a house, Montpelier, that was in disrepair, and he had a lot of repairs he had to make to it. So he actually had to find work after the presidency. So he went back to working as a lawyer, as an attorney, and took on clients. And he also then took over at the University of Virginia as the second rector there after Thomas Jefferson passed away. So very interesting that he ended up having to get some work after he had that time period. Anyway, so we're going to go ahead now and take a look at a video, and we'll come back on the other side and make some comments.
If men were angels, no government would be necessary. If angels were to govern men, neither external nor internal controls on government would be necessary. In framing a government which is to be administered by men over men, the great difficulty lies in this. You must first enable the government to control the governed, and in the next place, oblige it to control itself. James Madison, 1788.
He's known as the father of the Constitution, but James Madison was still a young man when he began shaping American political policy. At 25, he assisted in writing the Virginia State Constitution. He was the youngest member of the Continental Congress at age 29, and at just 36, he personally wrote much of the United States Constitution, the document that would serve as the foundation for America's new government. Madison's physical bearing made him seem even younger. He was 5'4" and about 100 pounds, with a soft voice that seldom carried to chamber back benches. To help compensate for his height, he adopted a springy walk that made him appear taller. He was from Virginia, where he was born to a slave-holding family and raised at Montpelier, his family's estate. He attended what is now Princeton University in New Jersey, where, already ambitious, he tried to do without sleep so he could study more. Known to friends as Jemmy, Madison was 43 when he began courting Dolly Payne Todd, a widow living in Philadelphia with a young son. Aaron Burr, Madison's friend from their days at Princeton, arranged for an introduction. In a letter to her best friend, Dolly wrote enthusiastically of meeting the man she called the Great Little Madison. The Madisons were married in September of 1794. They never had children of their own. They moved into the president's house in March of 1809. He was the nation's fourth president, serving 2 terms until 1817. George Clinton and Elbridge Gerry were his 2 vice presidents. Though Madison's policies weren't universally adored, his wife certainly was. Unlike her husband, who dressed in black, played chess, and suffered from anxiety attacks, Dolly Madison was vivacious, liked cards, and wore bright colors, silks, and turbans. All of Washington wanted to enter what author Washington Irving called the blazing splendor of her drawing room. In 1812, Mrs. Madison arranged the first wedding held at the White House. She also initiated 2 Washington customs, the inaugural ball and an annual Easter egg roll. Madison's administration coincided with the War of 1812, which in 1814 escalated to include attacks on American soil. Mrs. Madison was home planning a dinner party for 40 when the sounds of approaching British cannons frightened her into fleeing the president's house, her pet parrot in tow. She's also reported to have rescued Gilbert Stuart's painting of George Washington. Soon afterwards, the British set fire to the president's house, but not before eating the dinner Mrs. Madison's cooks had prepared, and the home was swiftly reduced to a charred, burned-out shell. Reconstruction efforts took 3 years. Most of this time, the first couple stayed in a Washington home called Octagon House. After the presidency, the Madisons retired to Montpelier. He became a gentleman farmer and succeeded his good friend Thomas Jefferson as the rector of the University of Virginia. Nevertheless, their finances dwindled. He fell ill in June of 1836. As the summer wore on, his doctor offered him stimulants to keep him alive for the 4th of July, so that he, like Adams, Jefferson, and Monroe, might die on the anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. Madison waved off such a notion, however, and died on the morning of June 28, 1836. He was 85.
Tonight, as we continue to report the...
All right, so lots of interesting things in that video. You could hear the importance of Dolly Madison as his wife, as what many referred to her as is the first lady, incredibly social person. You could hear everyone in DC wanted a ticket to the White House to come to her big parties that she would throw. Everyone wanted to be in her drawing room. She would have big lavish events with lots of food and drink, everyone dressed to the hilt. Whereas Madison was the meek-voiced, very kind of shy, introspective thinker kind of person. Preferred being in the back room playing chess or having a one-on-one or a small conversation with a small group. Um, he kind of let her be the front face of the White House and of his administration. She really was kind of almost like his spokesperson. He was a shy person, and she was very much an extrovert. So opposites do attract. It was a true love story between the two of them, and even after he died, she continued to be involved in the government, and she would continue in future administrations to help assist and consult with how to put on White House events. So a very important person, Miss Dolly Madison. Um, some other things you heard there, not all of his policies were popular. The War of 1812 itself, as we mentioned, was very controversial. Um, the first war after the Revolutionary War for the new country, and probably the first war that you had real protests going on in all cities around the country. People that very much were unhappy with the overall policy, with fighting with England again. People were, even 40 years later, war weary, wanted to just have peace and have harmony. And so he had to administer and tend to that war in the face of pretty substantial resistance. And we know all about that today. There's always going to be that population that is against the war. So anyway, very interesting stuff there. You heard a little bit about when the British did come to Washington during the War of 1812, they burned the city to the ground, including the White House. Madison actually, when they arrived in D.C., was away at a meeting over on the Virginia side of the Potomac. And Dolly Madison heard the British cannon and evacuated herself and her entire staff on several horse-drawn carriages. And they had already gotten in those carriages and started to pull away, and she had them stop because she had forgotten the George Washington portrait. And she felt that was very important to take with her and to preserve for the Union, that George Washington was that important a figure for the founding of the country that she couldn't allow the Brits to come in and destroy that portrait. So she ran back in, had several people help her pull it down off the wall, and they took it away with them. And it's back in the White House again today. So very interesting thing that she did there for the country. One other interesting tidbit, we'll talk about this in one of the little known facts, but when the British did come into the White House, they took a number of souvenirs of Madison's off of his desk. They kind of raided the what was the Oval Office back then. They ate his dinner, they drank his wine, they really kind of plundered the place, and were not kind to the overall building. Even started to do some graffiti in some places, but eventually, of course, the whole place was burned down. And as you saw, they ended up having to live in the Octagon House for a year until the White House was reconstructed. So that's some interesting little tidbits about Madison there. We're now going to go to my favorite part of the program, which is 25 little known facts about James Madison. And we'll take a look together and we'll talk about it on the other side. All right, so the first item, James Madison was prone to sickness. We heard about that little fact in his youth when I was talking about he being a very sickly boy. He actually was the same in his adulthood. I don't know if it was that he was a hypochondriac his whole life or that he really did have ailments, but he had frequent stomach aches. He had all kinds of different flus and attacks. He had epilepsy, and he had other kind of chronic ailments throughout his life. So very interesting that he had to deal with that all the way through. Number two, James Madison fought and won an oratory duel with Patrick Henry, which everyone at the time thought was impossible. Patrick Henry was known as pretty consistently the top debater in the entire United States. But he was debating against him around whether Virginia should adopt the Constitution. This was at the ratifying convention held in 1788 in Richmond. And Patrick Henry very much vehemently against this and was arguing against it. And every time he would argue something, Madison would very calmly, and in some cases quietly, but calmly retort everything that Patrick Henry said. he'd always have a counter argument against it and talk about why the Constitution was good for Virginia and good for all of the states. In the end, Madison won this argument, and the representatives of Virginia voted 89 to 79 in favor of ratification. So Madison obviously being a huge part of that. Number 3, James Madison competed with James Monroe for a seat in the newly minted House of Representatives. This was well before either man was president, and as we know, James Monroe actually succeeded James Madison as president, as our 5th president. So they had a battle. They were both politically active in Virginia, and of course, Madison ended up decisively winning the 1789 House seat to go to D.C. from Virginia. Throughout their campaign, the two got along quite well, and they would accompany each other en route to debates, which was really an interesting part of civility back then, that the two rivals would actually accompany each other, go get meals together, and actually ride together to their debates. Number 4, James Madison once thought America should rent Portugal's navy. Really interesting idea. America didn't really have its own navy for the most part. It had a couple of ships, but Madison suggested as a congressman that maybe the American government should just rent Portugal's navy to fight off pirates instead of constructing its own and spending all the money to do so. It's a really interesting idea. It's not something they ended up taking up, but was actually debated on the House floor. Number 5, James Madison fathered no biological children. So he had no children of his own. He did help raise one, however, and you'll see his picture there to the right. His name was John Payne Todd, and was Dolly's only child from her first marriage, who had died the year before she married Madison. So he took up the fatherhood role for John Payne Todd and considered him his son all the way through his life. Number 6, James Madison and wife Dolly Madison loved ice cream. So before freezers came along, ice cream was a very labor-intensive treat. That did not stop the Madisons from serving several varieties of this chili dessert during their tenure in the White House. They took over the practice from Thomas Jefferson, who was in the administration before theirs, who had introduced ice cream to the American public, and he actually had the first ice cream recipe. So the Madisons loved ice cream as well, and they carried this tradition on in the White House. Apparently, First Lady Dolly's favorite flavor was oyster ice cream. And in the book that I was reading about her, it said, don't knock it until you've tried it. So maybe you have to go find some oyster ice cream somewhere and see what it's like. Number 7, James Madison employed a number of secret codes. So Madison, just like any good politician at the time, he was terrified of any idea that someone might intercept some of his private letters. So along with Jefferson and other mutual allies, Madison used complicated encryption patterns when relaying delicate info in a letter back and forth. And so it's very interesting to think of in our modern day warfare. Of course, we use encrypted codes to encrypt messages. They were doing that back in revolutionary and post-revolutionary times, using encryption to relay messages to each other, but make sure that anybody who might intercept those letters could not know what they're talking about. So he had a quote there in one of his letters: having now the use of my cipher, which is, of course, a code. He informed Jefferson in 1784, after mastering a new system, now I can write without restraint. Number 8, when British burned part of James Madison's White House, they also ate his dinner. So I kind of alluded to this a little bit earlier, but on August 24th, 1814, an eerie emptiness fell upon the presidential mansion, and as British forces advanced towards D.C., Madison's home and office were completely abandoned mere hours before it was besieged. And in addition to breaking in and setting the place ablaze, the Brits gobbled up his meal that had been intended for the president. The meal included drinks of apple cider and wine. Number 9, both James Madison's vice presidents actually died in office. What an ironic thing that was. George Clinton, who's there on the left, died in 1812, near the end of James Madison's first term. His short-lived replacement, just for a mere 9 months, was Massachusetts Governor Elbridge Gerry, who redistricted that state of Massachusetts to tip the political scales in his own favor. And this is a process we still do today, very controversial, called gerrymandering, which was named after Elbridge Gerry. And it's a way of slanting your district or your state in a way that allows you better political fate. So Gerry also died in office, and Gerry was the only signer of the Declaration of Independence to be buried in Washington, D.C., and that's still the case today. Very interesting. Number 10, James Madison had a sharp sense of humor. So politics is a pretty serious career, but did not take away from his sharp sense of humor. Among friends, he was known for his quick wit, his quippy banter, his hearty belly laughs, and well-timed personal anecdotes. So although James Madison had a kind of a low, soft voice, he was very fun to be around and loved a good joke. Number 11, James Madison once proposed a brutal hangover experiment. So in 1804, at a party thrown in Jefferson's honor, who was president at the time, journalist Samuel Harrison Smith spent part of his evening drinking with Secretary Madison, who was the Secretary of State at the time. And Madison voiced his desire to find out how many glasses of champagne it would take to trigger a headache the next day, or literally to how long, or how many glasses would it take to create a hangover. And it was never written down or known how many glasses it took to complete this experiment. Kind of interesting that he would actually want a hangover. Number 12, James Madison helped amend Virginia's state constitution at the ripe old age of 79. So as we talked about earlier, he was the original writer of the Virginia Constitution and helped shepherd it through to its passage. Well, it went through a major amendment process many, many years later when he was 79 years old. And this was his last public service that he did to a 96-person assemblage. Last time he was actually doing something as a politician, close to the end of his life. Number 13, James Madison played a big role in establishing the University of Virginia. Among University of Virginia's original trustees, Madison later served as its second rector after Thomas Jefferson's death. From 1826 to 1836, he served as rector. And he bequeathed almost his entire personal library to the school. So you see a picture of University of Virginia on the left. On the right, that is a picture of James Madison University, which is about 65 miles away in Harrisonburg, Virginia. He did not found that school, but it was founded later and then named after James Madison. Number 14, James Madison was the last surviving signer of the U.S. Constitution. So all those great men and great founders that signed that original document written by Jefferson, he was the last one to survive of that group of men. For months, he was dying and bedridden. On June 28, 1836, he found he couldn't swallow his breakfast anymore. His niece, Nellie Willis, asked him, "What's wrong, Uncle James?" And he said, "Nothing but a change of mind, my dear." And then he died. Number 15, James Madison's face appeared on the $5,000 bill. As it says here, good luck getting your hands on one of these bills. The government stopped printing them in 1945 since they were becoming a favorite of counterfeiters. So if you do get a chance to get yourself a $5,000 bill, hold on to it. I'm sure it's worth much more than that. Number 16, he truly was the founder of the Constitution. He was the advocate of the Virginia Plan, as we mentioned earlier at the Constitutional Convention. He spent many hours studying government lectures and structures from around the world before coming up with the basic idea of a blended republic. That was the concept that was so brilliant. It had never been tried before, and he came up with this original idea. He was a key player in all the discussions and forcefully argued for many of the items that eventually made it into the Constitution, including a population-based representation in Congress, the need for checks and balances, and the support for strong federal executive while balancing states' rights. So he really found a way very brilliantly in that document to balance what needed to be a strong federal government, but also strong state governments. Number 17, the president, he was president during World War of 1812. As we mentioned, you can see up at the top there, this was called Mr. Madison's War, especially by his critics. It was a very controversial war at the time. He went to Congress asking for a declaration of war against England that started the War of 1812. It actually only passed by one vote. So that shows you how controversial it was even in the beginning. The reason that he and the administration wanted to go to war is the British would not stop harassing American ships and imprisoning soldiers that were on those ships. So Americans struggled in this war at the beginning, losing Detroit without a fight. And then Commodore Oliver Hazard Perry was the first victory that we had in that war, leading to the defeat of the British on Lake Erie. However, the British were still able to march on Washington later in the war, as we talked about in 1814, and burn the city to the ground, including the White House. The war ended in a stalemate in 1814 with a truce, as both countries' treasuries were drained at the time. 18, he was our shortest president, and that continues even to today. He was measured at 5'4" and was estimated to weigh about 100 pounds. Observers often remark that he looked like a young boy, even as an adult. You can see in these pictures here, he really did look like a teenager, even though this is in these pictured here, he's in his late 30s. So he really made up for his stature with the respect that he gained from the rest of the nation. Number 19, one of the three authors of the Federalist Papers. He wrote the Federalist Papers along with Alexander Hamilton and John Jay. These 85 essays were printed in 2 New York newspapers at the time as a way to argue for the Constitution to be passed by the state of New York. One of the famous ones of these papers that is constantly referred to is paper number 51, which Madison penned himself. It contained the famous quote, "If men were angels, no government would be necessary." Actually, you can look up the Federalist Papers even today on the internet if you want to read through them all. It is a long read, but pretty amazing the things they were talking about back then and how relevant they still are today. He was the primary author of the Bill of Rights. So Madison was one of the main proponents of passage of the first 10 amendments to the Constitution, which, as we know today, are called the Bill of Rights. They were ratified in 1791. Ironically, he was against the Bill of Rights at first, as we talked about earlier, thinking that state constitutions had it handled for individual rights. He was later convinced by other members of Congress that a Bill of Rights was necessary to bring the southern states into the fold and get them to pass. See a couple good quotes here by Madison around the Bill of Rights. The purpose of Constitution is to restrict the majority's ability to harm the minority. It really was one of the true genius things about the government that the founders formed was, in most of human history, the majority always rules, but this Constitution was put together in a very careful way to protect the minority as well, and minority rights. The quote in the middle is something I personally believe as well, those who are constitutionalists, that the powers delegated by the Constitution to the federal government are few and defined. And basically, if it's not in the Constitution, it's not a power of the federal government and needs to be legislated or added to as an amendment. Number 21, he co-authored the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions. So during John Adams' presidency, our second president, he passed the Alien and Sedition Acts that were passed to curtail certain forms of political speech and really curb the First Amendment a lot during that time. Madison and Jefferson joined forces to create the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions in opposition to the Alien and Sedition Acts. He helped to get Jefferson elected on that platform and became vice president. So pretty interestingly, they did these 2 resolutions, wrote them both, Kentucky and Virginia, and they did them as ghostwriters. So Adams never found out until after he was out of office that it was Jefferson and Madison who had written these resolutions against his policy. 22, he married Dolly Payne Todd Madison. We spoke a little bit about her earlier. You can see she was a very majestic woman. She was one of the most well-loved first ladies in our history. She was known as a terrific hostess and the original founder of the White House gathering or White House event. She was considered America's first lady. And actually, when Thomas Jefferson's wife had died and was serving as president, she helped him at official state functions since her husband was vice president. So it was really nice of her to kind of fill in as the first lady role when Jefferson didn't have a first lady. When she married Madison, she had been disowned by the Society of Friends, which was a group that her whole family was in, because James Madison was not a Quaker. So interestingly enough, Society of Friends kicked her out of the group. She had the only one child we talked about earlier by a previous marriage. 23, Aaron Burr introduced James Madison to his wife, Dolly. So Alexander Hamilton's future dueling opponent knew Madison through Congress, where he also worked at the time, and he had gotten acquainted with Dolly by virtue of her mother's boarding house up in New York, which Aaron Burr frequently visited. So very interestingly, he knew Dolly and introduced him directly to the single bachelor, James Madison. Number 24, the Non-Intercourse Act and the Macon's Bill number 2. So there were two foreign trade bills passed during his time in office, the Non-Intercourse Act of 1809 and Macon's Bill number 2. The Non-Intercourse Act was relatively unenforceable, allowing the U.S. to trade with all nations except France and Great Britain. Madison extended the offer that if any other nation were to protect American shipping interests, they would be allowed to trade anytime they wanted. In 1810, this act was repealed by the Macon's Bill number 2. It said that whichever nation stopped attacking American ships would be favored or have favored nation status. The U.S. would stop trading with that other nation. France agreed, but Britain continued to imprison soldiers and take ships. So you can see what the country was trying to do during this time and during his administration was curb this trade poaching that was happening on the high seas by any country that would attack American shipping. Some of it was successful, some of it was not, but eventually Macon's Bill number 2 was the law of the land and repealed that original act. Very difficult problem trying to solve here on the high seas. Number 25, the Hartford Convention against his actions. So the Hartford Convention was a secret Federalist Party meeting that occurred without Madison and his administration's knowledge. They had individuals meet from Connecticut, Rhode Island, Massachusetts, New Hampshire, and Vermont, and they were opposed to Madison's trade policies and the War of 1812 that we just talked about. And they came up with a number of new amendments they wished to have passed to address those issues, and they wanted to come to Congress with those amendments. When the war ended, news about the secret meeting came out, and the Federalist Party was discredited and eventually fell apart. So essentially, this meeting that took place discredited the party so badly that it ended up fading into oblivion. So there's the 25 little known facts about Madison. I hope you enjoyed that. It's always one of my favorite parts of the program about our founding fathers. So much interesting things to learn about all these men who helped create our country. I hope you take some time to dig into Madison a little bit more and the great things that he accomplished. Really incredible what he was able to do in his life. And I do think he's a little bit passed over among our founding fathers compared to some. So please dig into his life, and please like this video and subscribe to the channel, and make sure you look at some of our new content that's coming down. We're really excited about what we have coming your way. Thank you very much, and have a great evening.